Okay, so lesson 2, key early manuscripts and textual variants. Before we start, we'll just pray. Dear Lord, thank you for this time. Thank you again that we can come together and study these topics. Just pray, Lord, it wouldn't just be a time just to gain knowledge, but also to thank you for preserving your word and giving to us today, that we can use it and learn more about you and share your word with other people. Thank you again for this time. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so just a reminder, we'll be looking at 3 different periods of time. So we're still in the first period, which is the early church, which is the first 4 centuries of Christianity. And so, and then next lesson will also be the last one for that period. Okay, so we'll get straight into it. So introduction to early manuscripts. So we spoke about these last time, but we're going to get a bit more into it, some of the differences and the key variants. The first one is the Codex Sinaiticus, and these little symbols, this is a Hebrew letter Aleph, that's the symbol for it. So if you open this up and you're on the bottom and you see that symbol, that says, well, this part comes from this manuscript. And so that's roughly dated to 4th century AD. It was discovered by a German biblical scholar named Konstantin von Tischendorf in 1844. He sort of was already in that field of studying various manuscripts. He gained a reputation for it because he translated already some other manuscripts, but this was a major find for his career. That's a picture of him there. And this was found, there was more than one visit. So he came to Sinai, and there was an old church there, St. Catherine's Monastery, I believe it's an Orthodox church. And the story goes, and there are people who disagree with the story, but anyway, the official story is that he went there, they gave him some manuscript, but then he saw basically like a bucket, like a waste bin type of thing, like a bin, and there was all these manuscripts pages in there, basically ready to be burnt. And the story is that he stopped them and said, no, these are ancient manuscripts. Yeah. And so then they basically gifted most of them to him. He took them back, and then he went back again. And this is where the story gets a bit funny, is because after what they gave him was basically like very clean manuscripts, like they weren't dirty or anything. So there's been some suggestion that they could be forgeries, but that's not the official story, so I'll just leave that.
Copies.
It's possible, it's possible. But lately there's been some suggest that it could have been forged because he was sponsored by the Russian Tsar at the time, and he sent him to get this, and there's a whole bunch of things, but we won't get into it. That's conspiracy mode, but which would be interesting, because if it happens to be founded as a forgery, then that changes a lot of things for the critical text people. But anyway, so date 1844 was the first discovery of him. The contents of this manuscript contains almost the entire Bible, Old and New Testament. The text type is Alexandrian, so this is part of the basis for the critical text. And its notable features that we have is obviously numerous corrections and editorial revisions, and that is known because there are certain symbols and certain ways in which scribes would correct texts when they're looking at them. And so the first guy might have wrote it down in one way, and there's another guy later who's sort of correcting his mistakes, but those are shown in various symbols that they use. But that also reveals to us that the transmission of this text was quite unstable. It wasn't like a stable text as well. It omits. These are some of them that I'm sure there's plenty more that it omits, but Mark 16, the longer ending of Mark, which we have in the King James, and the story of the woman caught in adultery, that's also omitted. And the significance of this text is it's obviously used by modern textual critics who provide the base for the modern Bibles that we have today. Okay. You still want to write down? Okay. The next one is goes hand in hand in a sense, is Codex Vaticanus, and that's symbolized by the B as a manuscript symbol. Again, similar time as the Sinaiticus, which is the 4th century. And we don't know exactly where it's from, but it was found in the Vatican Library, and it was in the Vatican Library since the 15th century. So before that, we don't know where this has come from, which is interesting, and it might be a bit concerning, but
Vatican
yeah.
Must be true.
Was there any indication that the Crusaders, especially against Templars, had a...
That's possible, yeah.
Yeah, because they sort of started disappearing in the 15th century.
Yeah, okay.
Just before that.
Yeah, okay. That would probably make sense. But I couldn't find anything before that. But all I could find was that it was in the Vatican Library since the 15th century. Since it is an Alexandrian type text, which comes from obviously Egypt, someone brought it there. So the contents of this manuscript is again similar to the Sinaiticus, almost in the entire Old Testament, but the Old Testament is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, so the Septuagint, which is symbolized by the LXX, and then the New Testament as well. The parts that were missing from the Old Testament, parts of Hebrews, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon, and Revelation. So there's a few things missing from there. This is obviously an Alexandrian text from Egypt. And significance of this text is it's considered by various biblical scholars to be one of the most reliable witnesses to the early text, and that's basically because of its age. But that's debated. And obviously it lacks the Byzantine readings, simply it is an Alexandrian text as well. Okay, so I've got a picture of, this is the Vatican Library, or part of it. So just for context.
Not everyone can go there, right?
No, well I found out because I was like, can anyone just go there? I think there's certain parts that you're allowed, because I found out you could buy a pass and go in, but I think you couldn't go everywhere. Obviously, it's probably certain closed off for like more academics and things like that.
Does the church actually know what they've got? Have they ever?
I don't know if they've got there's probably things in there that they haven't looked. Yeah.
Just unlocking.
Because
I've read some books where they've said that they have no idea what's in there.
yeah, they probably just put everything in there, and who knows? And there's a similar situation with you got over 5,000 biblical manuscripts, and not all of them. I'll take that back. We got with the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found all those fragments and various scrolls and things. A lot of them haven't even been looked at or translated yet. So it's just time, effort, and who's going to do that, and AI will probably end up doing it.
It's either in Israel or California. That's always confused me.
Which one? Sorry.
The Dead Sea Scrolls.
Israel. So there was in I think it's 1948 it was discovered in all the little caves, and there's like jars. Yeah. So that's where they found the scroll of Isaiah.
Oh, I know where the famous scroll is.
Yeah.
people buying certain ones.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So there's a bit of a black market there.
Yeah, there would be, yeah,
And then the Israel state come intervene and they put a clamp on it.
yeah.
You could buy the Dead Sea, like somewhat the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Probably not anymore, but yeah, probably in the early times people were, yeah, because yeah, that's how it was. A lot of people have private collections and things like that. And that's what happened to a lot of the ancient Greek stuff. It was all like, yeah. Um, yes, so yeah, we still have a lot of things that haven't even been looked at. So, and yeah, Vatican Library being as old as it is, I would say they don't even know what's in there. Yeah. Well, they do, but then they don't allow anyone to see it. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so that's the Vatican Library. The other type of manuscript that we have is the early papyri, or the papyrus that we have. And these typically date from the 2nd to 3rd century. And I just have a few notable ones that I mentioned. So the first one is P52. This is dated to about from 180 to 125. And this is a fragment of the Gospel of John. And before this discovery, and because it's actually very small, because it's so small, it's so fragmentary that no one really knows if it's an Alexandrian text or a Byzantine type text, because there's not enough information to know. Oh, sorry. Oh, no, I'll show you the picture after. I was looking at the picture thinking you could see it. So anyway, this is quite significant because I guess in terms of the Gospel of John, because before this discovery, the Gospel of John was pushed into the 200s, and basically denying it was actually John. But then when they discovered this, it pushed it back, because if you found a copy in 100 AD, then obviously that came from another copy which was much earlier. So that proves most likely it was John, so we believe it's John, and it pushes it back to the first, when the eyewitnesses were still alive.
So John wrote that before he was sent to Paphos.
There's different ideas. Whether he wrote at the similar time with the Book of Revelation, which
For a few years before.
so
according to the dates for his style.
So they for Book of Revelation they date about 90 AD around there. The Gospel is with dating it's a little bit of a you can just it's rounded Well, you do have good reasons for like some dates, but it's not like some of them you can find quite accurate, and then the others are a bit more like a few years here and there, depending on But it seems like more and more the consensus is now starting to push it very early. A lot of the New Testament, whereas 100 years ago, 200 years ago, there were, especially in the German higher criticism, put it all later, denying a lot of. That's where all this authorship language came from. Authorship and the dating came from all that, and so
There were spoilers there.
Yeah.
Doesn't fit in the error history.
So there was this. So like I said, it confirms the early circulation of John's Gospel, which because that's a good indication for the rest of the other manuscripts that we have as well. So this is the little fragment. So it's quite small actually. So this is the front side of it, and this behind it. So the front bit here is John 18:31, verse 31 to 33, and this is verse 37 to 38. Yes.
It's pretty cool, actually.
Yeah, it's like little.
Actually have that.
Yeah. So that's a papyrus. The next one is P66, which is AD 100, 150, around there. It contains most of John's Gospel. This manuscript is, I guess, significant because it contains, it shows multiple layers of corrections. So they're often, obviously, by later scribes. So again, this showing, and this is obviously an Alexandrian text, it shows that the text was edited over time, probably reflecting different disagreements about the proper wording or attempts to correct perceived errors. So the Codex Sinaiticus, for example, has been corrected by several different scribes over time, and that can be seen in the style of the how it's written. People have studied that, so you can tell it's a different person. And it also shows that the text again was not viewed as just a stable text. That's just what it was. It wasn't settled, so they kept editing and correcting it as well. And so obviously by instability we mean that the text was not copied in a consistent way. Different story if it was like a spelling correction or something like that. That's a different thing, because you're just cleaning it up. Whereas this seems to be alterations to the text. Different from one another in wording, and again, it's not uniform, and therefore preservation of it can be a bit suspicious. Whereas the Byzantine was quite stable in its copying in its text. So most of John's Gospel and scribal corrections as well, which, other than showing that it was an unstable text, shows us the principles and the practices of scribes anyway. Just historically, it shows us that, so that's quite interesting. This is a copy of it, some of the pages of it. Gospel of John. The other one we have is P75, a little bit later, 175 to 225. And this has contains a bit more, so it's got Luke, not as big as 66 because that's basically a whole book, but it's got some references to Luke 3, 18 to 24, and then John 1, the first 50 chapters of John. I guess it's the majority of John. And this aligns with Vaticanus, and again demonstrates alterations rather than preservation, which is a similar thing with all these texts. So there's I think 170 papyri from memory, around that figure. So, but these are one of the main ones. A lot of them are quite small and it's very fragmentary type ones, but these are the sort of crucial ones that we have. I think this is just someone just made a copy of it. Okay, so I've got this, I don't know if you have copies of the notes, but I put a table on the ones, I think I left them blank. These two sides over here. So,
Do you have any of those?
yes. Do you got, Josh, do you need one? You got one?
Last one? Yeah.
This week?
No.
Yeah.
I didn't need to write any of that down. It's all here.
Oh, no, I have it.
Oh, I think you gave it.
Is the chart?
That's fine. There we go. Yeah, that's all good. You're right. Thank you.
So again, there's obviously more variants, but these are the main ones that are generally brought up in discussions with the differences of the texts. But there's a lot more variants. But these are the ones that are generally brought up. Yeah. Yeah, so you can see the Byzantine textual tradition or text, which obviously underlines the TR, has been consistently preserved through the church, local churches over time, and that's where the term received text, which is Textus Receptus, comes from, because it's been received by the majority of churches. Which the Alexandrian manuscripts, they show numerous omissions, and it's a lot of uncertainties in their texts, and much fewer texts as well, manuscripts. But we'll go through each of these variants as well next. All good? Okay. Alright, so we'll look at the first one. So this is the Mark 16, verse 9 to 20, which is known as the longer ending of Mark. And this was omitted by the Alexandrian text, both the Vaticanus and the Sinaiticus.
Sorry, second. It says 9 to 20. 9 to
You've
verse.
got 9 to 12.
Oh, maybe I wrote the wrong thing. Yeah, 9 to 20. Mark 16.
Yeah, Mark 16. Yeah, it goes to 20.
Yeah, okay.
But you had here 9 to 12.
Oh, maybe on
thing.
yeah, that's
So
probably,
I thought it was like a little section.
no, okay, yeah, sorry. It should be the whole, yeah, that's just a typo. Yeah. Okay. Yes, so it's included in this longer ending is included in the Byzantine. And some explanation for this. So the absence from Alexandrian texts, as that scholar suggested, it was a later addition. Obviously, because they believe that Sinaiticus and Vaticanus are much older. So therefore, if it's not in the older text, then it must be an addition. That's the logic. We can read it. If so, the critical text or the Alexandrian text end at Mark 16:8. So that's where it ends. So it ends with the women fleeing the tomb, and it just cuts off. So where am I here? The other thing is the majority of so it has that, but yet the majority of Greek manuscripts that were actually used by churches had this longer ending. So again, there's a wide usage of that. There's a wide acceptance of that, and the theological significance of this is that the omission removes key resurrection appearances and the Great Commission. Great Commission. Now, the argument would be, oh well, it's okay. It's in another gospel. You know, why do we? Does it matter if it's missing from Mark's gospel? Well, it does, because it wasn't or just one book. It wasn't just made one book straight away. This only Mark would have been sent to another place. So if it's missing that aspect, then again, those group of people don't have that story, because they might not have Matthew, Mark, or Luke. I mean, Matthew and Luke, or John. So it is significant, and it does remove, key resurrection.
How does this tee up with Mark was the first gospel?
Yes, so there is that. Yeah, the consensus with biblical scholars is that Mark is the early. So the idea is that Mark was the earliest, and then Matthew and Luke had. So there was a separate source. They're called Q source, which is basically the oral tradition of Jesus, and then you have Mark's gospel, and so then you have Matthew and Luke. Why these are synoptics? Why they have similar stories? They say, well, Matthew used Mark as a basis, and also Q. So that's why the differences. And then obviously Matthew had some of his he added in some things, and Luke did the same. So you can tell, okay, what's Luke's writing, which is different to Matthew, and then what's the similarities of Matthew and Luke, which comes from Mark. So that's a whole. It's called a Q hypothesis, and Q just means, I think.
It's not a coincidence then.
No, well, it's the theory, yeah. Which it sort of makes sense with Luke, because he tells you that he has engaged different eyewitnesses and people, so that makes sense the way he did it. Matthew, he could have been writing at the same time that Jesus was saying something. He could have been writing. We don't know.
No, but Luke, the record of Luke was to a Jew.
No, he wasn't.
You
Yeah,
see that?
yeah. So he was.
I would take both with Luke.
Yeah,
and with
it's
Jew.
yeah.
Matthew's quite good in the.
Well, they all have different purposes for why they're writing, and the different target audiences. But anyway, so that's why I think it is significant that it's removed, because the people today will be like, oh, well, it's in the other Gospels. But the point is, they didn't have. Not every church had all those other Gospels to reference, to look at, and so where would they get their resurrection?
Well, some of them even only work in Paul's letters.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. So that's why it's crucial. We want to have everything, not missing bits and pieces. Okay, so the next one is John 7, which is the woman caught in adultery. Again, this is omitted from the Alexandrian texts. They don't. They either don't contain. Obviously, there's different texts. Some contain. They don't contain this passage, or don't even mark it with critical notes as well. So there's no mention of that. It's included in the Byzantine texts, as we know, and records Jesus' forgiveness of the woman. Okay, so some of the explanations for this is it's argued to be later due to its missing in the early, again, the same argument that they use in some early manuscripts, which is, you can't even trust that, because they will agree that it's been edited. So how can you trust? It's obviously demonstrated it's been edited. How can you trust? Wouldn't the addition of it be more important than the dating? Because if it's dated early, but yet it's been, edited 3, 4, 5 times, then that kind of argument doesn't hold anything in there. So whether it is early or not, it doesn't really matter anymore, because you've already admitted that it's been edited several times, and so you can easily argue that they've taken this story out for whatever reason. So early church fathers, as they call them, Ambrose and Augustine, they reference this text, so that's significant. So it was at least that early, when was it? 4th century, Augustine, I think. And the theological significance is that it highlights Christ's mercy and his authority over the law. Again, someone can say, well, you can find it in any other gospel, his mercy and his authority over the law, but again, that lacks understanding of the time and how the various gospels were sent around in various churches. Okay, so yeah, again, this is a heavily debated one that you'll find. If you looked into some of this topic, they will mention, especially, basically all of these ones that we're going to look at. I recently heard, I wasn't aware of it, but I recently heard, now this is from a manuscript scholar he's obviously leans towards the critical text, but he mentions that this story, he believes there's some evidence that it's mentioned in there's some manuscripts of Luke, and that story is mentioned there, and it's also sometimes mentioned here. So whether or not it was just a story that was going around and one of the writers added it in, which is what they would say. But anyway, that's just something recently I heard. Okay, so we got that one. The next one is 1 John 5:7, which is known as the Comma Johannem. And yes, okay, so this is Alexandrian texts partly omit this verse. So they have the first part of it, which it says, "For there are three that bear record," and then that's it, and it goes on to the next verse. Whereas the Byzantine text includes the full verse, which says, "For there are three that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, and these three are one," which is a very heavy Trinitarian text, which is, it's quite clear. So the red is obviously what's in the Byzantine. Okay, so the longer ending is absent for most. And so this is one of the manuscripts that it's a hard time defending. One of the verses that's hard time defending because it is actually absent in most early Greek manuscripts, but appears later in the Latin manuscripts, and so that's one of the sort of the sticking points, like arguing just from a textual point of view. Again, there's doctrinal importance of the Trinity in the Byzantine reading. Obviously, that's quite a clear verse about the Trinity. But there is some argument from the Byzantine text side that what they call providential preservation. And so basically what that is, so there's a view of this text. So it argues that God was divine, that God has divinely preserved his word throughout history, ensuring that authentic reading of Scripture has been available to believers despite textual variations and manuscript transmission. So it's basically saying if it's genuine text, even though we have limited mention of it, if God allows it to be in the received text, which is used again widely by most churches in history, then that's more about his providential preservation rather than a textual, that there's evidence for it. And that might sound a little bit, it might sound a little bit hypocritical in the sense that, well, we argue against the Alexandrian text because that's not the majority. It's one of the arguments that we use. So but I guess this becomes more of a theological thing because it's about, okay, what do you believe about God and how he preserves his word, rather than a text evidence base or reason. So
when you were doing your studies, did you look at any of the Armenian or the Antiochian, especially the guys that have got their biggest congregations in Kerala and India, where they've got a few million?
I haven't looked at the Indian ones, but the Antioch a little bit,
Yeah, well,
that region, it's good. Even that you brought that up in Antioch, you had various preachers there, again, all their sermons, you can have them, they're recorded, like in text. They're quoting the Byzantine text, so that's again very early on. So it's again.
Well, I sat beside a guy at uni who was from that church. He
Ah,
was
yeah,
from
yeah.
Kerala.
Yeah.
And he had to go home at the end of his session with us to get married so that he could become a bishop.
Ah, okay.
Because
There'll be more like the Orthodox
yeah,
type.
similar,
Yeah, yeah.
similar.
The Eastern
But
Church.
they've got
Eastern.
a number of congregations in Germany and other parts of Europe. Germany being the biggest group,
Okay.
had for some reason, it must have
Yeah.
came out of Syria.
Yeah, possibly.
Because they definitely weren't Indian.
No, that's
They
right.
were
Yeah,
lighter shade.
yeah. Interesting. But yeah, all that
But then
part of it.
when he was finished and got married, before he became a bishop, he was going off to Maynooth in Ireland to see what the Jesuits had to tell.
Ah, okay. Yeah. It's very interesting. But yeah, that part of it. Yeah. That's basically where we're looking at all these Byzantine texts. Yeah, so there's that idea of providential preservation. Yeah, so some hold that God's preservation was not necessarily in every single manuscript, but in the totality of manuscript tradition. So, for example, you could have, again, 90% of the manuscripts we have are Byzantine. There might be a percentage that don't have that verse or part of that verse, whereas others will have. So the argument is that
So was
Yeah.
all this related then, and the scriptures as we know them now, was that around about the first council of Nicaea or something?
no, the Council of Nicaea was a bit different because that didn't really have much to do with the compilation of the scriptures. More about it was a very small part of their council. That all they did was just recognize the books, the canon.
So
It doesn't say anything about which type of manuscripts. It doesn't really say. I would say because of where it's located, it makes sense to be the Byzantine text because it's in Turkey there, which would have been part of that area. But yeah, the only issue that they discussed concerning the Bible was the canon. So they had which was already accepted by that time, but they just confirmed the list. Yeah, that's from the Nicaea.
but then the King James version doesn't tie in with the Jerusalem Bible or the Vatican.
No, it's got no
It has more
link to that. Yeah,
more, well, especially the Old Testament is almost verbatim the same as the Jewish scriptures.
that's right. And so the Old Testament, and I haven't got into the Old Testament specifically because it's quite a stable text. There's no real argument with any of it, with any side. So.
Did you ever have an opportunity to attend any synagogues in your training?
No, I didn't go while I was training, but I did go many years ago when I was still in school, visiting one. But yeah, it would be good to go again to see. Yeah.
That guy Butterworth, he could speak Hebrew
Yeah.
better than the Hebrews.
Yeah.
So he took us all around to the Liberal Synagogue in
Okay.
London.
Yep.
We were there quite a few times.
Okay.
And it was always bread, salt and wine.
Yeah.
You know, and they were emphasising the King of Salem given to Abraham.
Ah, yes.
The bread, salt and wine.
Yep. Yeah. So I've been once many years ago, but even more it would be good to go to Israel, and visit.
Yeah, what I find interesting is like how they get the outline up forward.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. So that's that topic. Okay. The next one is Luke 2:33. The use of the term Joseph or Jesus' father or his father. So Alexandrian text reads, "And his father and his mother marveled." The verse continues. Whereas the Byzantine text says, "And Joseph and his mother marveled." So some of the explanation of this, calling Joseph his father might be seen as questioning the virgin birth, which was quite significant at this time because that was a theological controversy early in the first couple of centuries. Some were, which is what they were dealing with at Nicaea, because the Arians were claiming that he was just a man, not divine, and so obviously if that was debated issue, those who had the ability to copy the texts, if they were from that group of people, well, the temptation there is to so again, it doesn't, and this is the thing, it's not it. You can obviously find it elsewhere because you could read, the angel telling Mary, it's going to be it's of God, and you can find that. But then when you're reading, then you come to this verse, and it says his father. Well, in the mind of is it one or the other? It just starts creating confusion and doubt, and we know God is not the author of confusion. So why would he allow that? It doesn't make sense. So again, the Byzantine ensures doctrinal clarity. It's clear that it's definitely a virgin birth, and there's no question about it from the Byzantine point of view. The theological significance, obviously, is that the Byzantine maintains the distinction of Jesus' divine conception. Again, which is one of the fundamentals of the Christian faith. Okay, so that one's that. And then we have the Acts 8:37, which is the Ethiopian eunuch's confession of faith. So the Alexandrian omits any verbal confession of faith. Okay. And then the Byzantine includes, this is basically the whole verse. And Philip said, "If thou believest with all thine heart, thou mayest." And he answered and said, "I believe that Jesus is the Son of God." So that's removed from the Alexandrian text. So this aligns with the modern textual criticism's tendency toward a eclectic text, and I'll mention what that is. And it weakens the clear precedent for believers' baptism as well, because you don't really find any clear statement of like that connected to baptism of a faith confession and then followed by a baptism. So theological significance of this is that the Byzantine preserves the profession and supports, again, the doctrine of personal belief in salvation, in regards to salvation. So with the term eclectic text, so in textual criticism, eclectic text basically just refers to a reconstructed version of the biblical text. And so there's no manuscript that would have the way it's written in this critical text. It's reconstructed from a range of multiple sources. Rather than following one single manuscript or manuscripts that are the same tradition. Basically textual scholars just compare the various readings. So they compare the Byzantine, Alexandrian, the Western. There's a few other ones that are insignificant, but they select from their criteria what they believe to be the most authentic reading, based upon internal and external evidence, and so then they create a critical edition like that, and they call it the eclectic text. So if they find, let's just say tomorrow they find another manuscript and it fits their criteria, they'll add that in, and they'll give it a grade, whether they think it's authentic or, questionable or an addition. Yeah. So again, it's a bit of a risky business, picking and choosing what you think is authentic, and especially from sources that, again, are provably been edited over many times. Okay, so and then the next one is Colossians 1:14, through his blood. So the Alexandrian reads, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. Whereas the Byzantine text says, in whom we have redemption through his blood, even the forgiveness of sins. So the explanation here is that it's obviously missing in Alexandrian texts. The Byzantine reinforces the importance of Christ's blood in redemption, and aligns with other passages of Ephesians 1:7, which agrees with that, with the Byzantine rendering. The theological significance is that the Alexandrian reading could weaken the explicit connection between redemption and the blood of Jesus, so the redemption and his sacrifice. It again, you can find it elsewhere, but it again weakens that doctrine. Did you still have your question? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so that's the main textual variants that we have, and these are the ones that will be argued with people who deal with this, and it goes on still. Okay, so the other thing is now in the defense of the Byzantine readings. So the first one is the majority reading argument. So because the Byzantine text represents the vast majority, about 90% of all the copies that we have, that obviously showing that it's a majority text, and reflects that, well, why would you keep copying something? You only keep copying something if you think it's valuable and necessary, and recognized as inspired or divine.
So Simon, just to make sure that I'm on the right page here, the majority of Greek manuscripts is from this Byzantine
Yep.
text, or right?
Yep.
And so the argument there is that because all the things that we've found, 90% belong to this group. Well, people are obviously copying them and using them in churches.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? As opposed to, we found one and it was sitting in the library.
That's right. That's 100% right. So it's and it shows. Okay, well, and it also goes, and I do mention it in this as well, that the Alexandrian was very localized in basically one area, whereas the Byzantine seems to be widespread throughout, the eastern, at least the eastern side of the Roman Empire, which is quite the difference there. So, which is the next point here. So the widespread nature indicates that they were commonly used in the churches, so across different geographical areas, and so it indicates that they were commonly used texts in the churches rather than localized variants.
So I know that this sounds like a really simple question, right? And it might sound dumb, but how does someone not go, just to make it real simple, there's 100 churches that are using this text, and there's one, and okay, maybe it's a bit of a straw man, and there's one in the library, there's another text over here in the library. I'm going to use
and it's different.
And I'm going to use that as the basis for truth. Obviously there must be a reason, right? People are kind of.
Yeah, it could be. There's probably a range of.
Right?
There's probably a range of reasons. I guess one of their main reasons is it's early. They always say that it's the earliest, therefore we can trust that.
It's the original.
Yeah, right. So it's closer to the original than these ones which were copied, which are copies that we have are much later, sure. But there is good evidence to suggest, there's good evidence to show that it was copied from much earlier texts, even though we don't have them all.
When was the fire in Alexandria?
We discussed this last time.
Yeah.
Yeah, we.
1200s or something.
No. It was.
Much earlier than that.
I think we had like
It was Caesar, wasn't it?
Two or.
Was it Caesar that started the Exodus in a civil war?
Was it like 90 BC?
Oh wow.
Something like that?
48
Or 80. Yeah.
48
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
It's like 1700s.
48 was 80.
Yeah, that makes more sense.
It
8.
was before Christ.
Yes. Yeah, so
Yeah.
less than 100 years before Christ. Yeah. Yeah.
What a loss.
So.
The amount of text that was just
Yeah.
Probably gone up easy.
Yeah, but most of the synagogues must have had
Yeah, they would have had.
majority of the
Yeah.
scriptures.
Well, they would have had the Old Testament for sure.
Yeah.
They were obviously. Yeah. Well, there was no Christians then, so.
Every synagogue.
It was burned in the Civil War.
Yes. Yeah.
By accident.
Just
That's
didn't
it.
happen.
Yeah, that makes. Yeah. Whoops.
Yeah.
Oh, the Greek guys.
Yeah.
The two Greek guys.
Yeah.
They probably, what was the other one?
Might have been Romans, kind of.
I think it was.
I'm pretty sure it's Caesar, right?
No, it was the guy in Damascus, one of,
Oh,
must have been one of
Seleucus.
Alexander's.
Yeah, the Seleucus. Yeah.
When
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
split, he split it amongst the three generals.
Yeah. Yeah.
And their descendants,
The Ptolemies were one of the descendants. Yeah.
the colonies were in Egypt.
Yeah. The Seleucids were in Syria. Yeah.
Antiochus or whatever you
Yeah.
call it was up there.
Yeah. The whole book of Maccabees. Yeah.
Yes, so he was the guy that put the pigs in the
Yes, on the altar.
temple.
Yeah.
It was prophesied of him, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Makes reference to that. Yeah. Anyway. Yeah. So I think about 80 something BC. Anyway, so the Byzantine text copies and obviously transmitted through church history rather than a small subset of earlier but more divergent Alexandrian texts, which, I think is quite a important fact.
So was there a great difference between the Byzantine and the earlier Alexandrian?
What were the differences?
Was there a great difference?
So I guess the verses that we just read earlier, that would be probably the main crucial ones. Whereas
So really nothing to
verses are missing and things like
get
this.
up and shout about.
Was Alexander
Yeah. What's that?
still alive when this was all happening? Alexander the Great.
No, he died much earlier. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't know, but that doesn't mean a thing. It's just two different scrapes of the batter.
I don't agree with that.
No, well, there is obviously smaller variants and other verses that changed things. So like whether it's removing the term Christ or Lord, like very small changes or variants. But I guess I wanted to sort of more significant ones. And again, because, and that's, if it was just that, okay. But the other issue is that there's evidence that it's been edited several times by different scribes. So we don't actually know.
Is this what we call redacting?
Yeah, you could say that. Yeah, you could say that.
This is what I was talking
Yeah, so it's because it's an uncertain text. I guess why would you use that one when you have ones that are more stronger and complete? Yeah.
about.
And again, just historically, and the preservation of the text and what we have now, obviously, this is more of a theological point. What Bible did, God use? Because you have this Alexandrian texts that were hardly used. They were sort of written and then we don't really see them used anywhere, and then they're discovered in 1844, Sinaiticus. So it's like, where was this? Where was it? Yeah, so if God wanted, if he wanted people to read that, then I'm sure he would have preserved it, and it would have been widely used. So that's obviously more of a theological point, but
This maybe seems like a weird take, but
It's-
would it be like if I was to write something out and in 2,000 years someone stumbled across it, it's like this is some sort of text to do with if I was back then.
yeah. So yeah, you would say that, but then they would see, okay, where was this actually come from? And again, why wasn't it? If it was so important and recognized as scripture, why wasn't it ever used and then copied? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and also we don't know the motive behind some of these changes as well. Like I said, there was a lot of, especially in that time, so it aligns with that time. It's quite interesting. They were denying, like a lot of groups were denying the divinity of Christ. There were, then the other opposite side, they were denying the humanity of Christ as well. Different other groups. So there's a lot of weird groups that were at that time, a lot of heretical groups. And it's interesting, I find, this is probably more like just interesting thought, how they were then rediscovered in the 1844 when all these other beliefs started coming out. That's when you see all the cults starting. That's when you see, obviously, evolution and all that theory. So there's a lot of doubts of so it seems like there's a whole history of, it's just interesting how that connects.
Something. Yeah, but I mean, you could like, all these verses that are omitted, right? If you just went through and preached through them, like, because they're in the Bible, preached through them. You're looking at with Mark, clear, and I get what you're saying, Simon, about there might be you might be able to find those truths elsewhere in the Bible, which I think just highlights how it's not that someone's crammed something in, because you can find all these truths throughout the Bible. So it's not like something sneaky coming in, but someone's went, I would say, I'm going to take that one out because it's too explicit, right? Or there's something to it. Because if you go through it and you think, well, in Mark it's talking about Christ, coming, like being risen from the dead, so there's clear victory over death and over sin. And then, in John, the mercy, the authority to, like, he is Lord, and he's talking about law and judgment.
Yep.
And then, 3:1, like that's so important. And then there in the book of Acts about, do you believe? Right? Yep, I believe. Okay, well, if you believe now, you can be baptized. Right? Like all those things. Like, to some extent, there'd be guys here that would preach on those verses and have a whole, like a series on those
Exactly,
verses, right?
yeah,
And then to have them gone, you're missing out on so much.
There's a lot, yeah. Yeah, so it's we can speculate on motives and things like this, but it does seem a lot of things connect. And one of the things for me is like, yes, it's the majority text that was used throughout history of Christianity. It was used. Why? And then you see this small subset of texts pop up much later. So there's some things there too. That a big question mark. Okay, and then we also have the Byzantine is more uniform and stable in its transmission, and compared to the Alexandrian text, there's a significant variation among its. So there's great variation, and it's only a few manuscripts. So you would think, okay, there might be an argument. Yeah, sure, maybe it's just a few manuscripts, but then they all sort of agree. That might be a different story, but they all, there's few, and they all have significant variations, which again, it's very shaky ground there to trust that. Yes, and then early church leaders and pastors and writers used the Byzantine reading. So I had for John Chrysostom, so he was in Antioch, and he used these readings. And you can still get his some of his sermons; they're recorded. I believe, Chrysostom means the golden mouth. Golden mouth. So he was known as like a great preacher. That was his nickname. Yeah. Okay. Yep. So that's one defense, the majority reading of the argument. The other one is the continuity of the church. So standard text used in Greek-speaking churches from the early centuries through the Reformation was the Byzantine text. So preserved, transmitted by predominantly the Orthodox Church, because that was in that area. So they were sort of responsible for copying and bringing that in, because that was the area that was predominantly found and used. Yeah, so, and which, providentially sort of shows why there was a continuous, why it was which is a much more stable text. So the Textus Receptus, which is based upon the Byzantine text, became the foundation of the Protestant Reformation Bibles, Tyndale, Geneva, King James, things like that. And then, so again, showing that the continual use of these texts, and also the use of this text within various churches in worship, in theology, in preaching across the centuries, again shows, supports its authenticity and as the preserved word. The Byzantine tradition demonstrates unbroken transmission within local churches, whereas the Alexandrian text largely disappeared from common use until its rediscovery in the 19th century. So we made those points. So the unbroken transmission is quite important, and shows within the local churches as well. So it was the churches that were responsible for or used in its preservation and transmission. Okay, so that's the other one, and the last defense of the Byzantine readings is its doctrinal considerations. So, which we've already really talked about, but the Byzantine readings emphasize the Christological clarity of Christ. So it makes it quite clear who he is, his divinity and the atonement. They're not ambiguous as in the Alexandrian texts. The omissions in the Alexandrian text raise theological concerns, like we've already mentioned this in those texts that we've looked at. The retention of the omitted passages in the Byzantine ensures that no doctrinally significant elements are lost or weakened. And then we also have that, so many of the omitted passages in the Alexandrian manuscripts align with, again, areas of controversy that the early Christians had to deal with. And we can look at that historically, we can find that. And so that, again, raises concerns. What's the theological motivations behind that have influenced these manuscripts? And so again.
The seeker-sensitive abit, the Alexandrian text.
Yeah.
Omit anything that's difficult or hard for people to swallow, and then
and it's probably interesting as well because
then it brings the same thing.
and I don't know if this is just now, if I'm just importing something from a modern view, but because Alexandria was considered to be cosmopolitan, it was an area of like university, education, and we seem to find a lot of progressive types in that environment, and so I wonder if it's maybe there's a correlation there.
Well, and then you look at what it begets, right?
Yeah.
And if you think about kind begetting kind, right? Well, then it gives us all
And
of
where
your
do we
modern versions that are soft.
exactly, and then we find those who do the critical texts, and then we get into Westcott and Hort and all that, and what they believed, they were considered liberal Christians. They weren't believing in the fundamentals. Well, that's the conclusion you have to come to. Yeah. We're just getting at that at a very slow that conclusion.
Gotta take the listener with us.
Yeah.
Spoiler alert, it's the devil, guys.
Yeah. So that's the defense that we have of the Byzantine readings, some of the main ones. And then we have a little, just want to look at this, so the difference, and this is probably more the approach, the differences in approach to the text. So there's preservation versus reconstruction. The King James Textus Receptus view believes that God providentially preserved his work through the Byzantine textual family. So ensuring its integrity and accuracy through the vast majority of manuscripts. Whereas the modern textual critics attempt to reconstruct the biblical text using fragmentary Alexandrian manuscripts. Which again exhibit significant omissions and inconsistencies within the text. And it can even, the inconsistencies might even be in the type of words that are used as well. So not necessarily just full verses, but the majority of variance is certain wording that we find. So the reconstruction approach introduces uncertainty. Scholars are left to determine the original text from a diverse array of conflicting readings. So again, that's the difference. So it's not just about, so I think one of the major things is, we can look at the motivations behind some of this, if there's some dark agenda or anything like that, and there may be. But back now in the modern times, when they're trying to reconstruct all these manuscripts, it's really a base, whether or not it's some, some conspiracy behind it or some, agenda. Basically, it's just a difference in philosophy and or basic difference in approach to the text. So obviously, the reconstructionists are not going to hold the doctrine of preservation high.
Even with all the best intentions, right?
Yeah.
That they're good people.
Yeah.
Right? They are essentially making themselves the standard.
Well, that's right. Because that was my question. Because when I studied this and even dealt with it when I was back in doing study, who determines? How do they create this criteria? Very different to, I guess, this to compare with the how they recognize the canon. They had those criteria make sense. Had to be connected with an apostle or someone who was associated with an apostle. It had to be widely used. Again, what text is widely used, and so those make sense. And that, I think, that sort of criteria fits with the preservation as well. Whereas the reconstruction seems to be man-made. Okay, and then we have the role of faith in textual selection again. So the reformers and the translators of the King James recognize the Byzantine as the Word of God, which aligned with the doctrine of preservation. The modern textual critics employ again the eclectic method that we spoke about, which selects readings they believe to be closest to the original. Again, the problem with this is that it introduces subjectivity and textual instability into the translation of the scriptures. Things we've already spoken about. Okay, and then we have the practical impact of the Bible versions. So these are the Bibles that are based upon the Textus Receptus. So before I show them, it doesn't mean they're all the same. There are issues with them, but these are considered to be Textus Receptus based translations. So obviously you have the King James, you have the New King James, and there's a bunch of others here. Obviously I'm not recommending to read them or such, but those would be considered if you searched up what Bibles were based on Textual Septus. That's what would come up. And then obviously for the modern translations, you have a whole alphabet here of Bible translations, and again they rely on the Nestle Aland or the UBS text for their translations, which is obviously heavily influenced by the Alexandrian manuscripts, which is why you pick up an NIV or ESV or whatever, and they'll have missing verses and changed.
Does that rely on the Nestle?
That should be rely, not reply. Yeah. 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 Okay.
I don't know there is the sort of messes things out.
Yeah, because I think that was the first one actually. That was the
Yeah, it was written in language similar to the King James version.
yes. So that's the one that was I'm pretty sure that was Westcott and Hort's text translation. So
I must check it out.
yeah, I have to look into. I'm pretty sure that one was. It was quite quite an early one. Okay, and then and so omitted verses and phrases, obviously that we looked at, removed in the modern versions, and they remove important theological affirmations present in the Byzantine text as well. So again, that's some of the implications for the transmission of each line. And so I'll end with some of these quotes. I've got 3 quotes from various scholars, and these quotes point out the issues with the eclectic text, the modern or the Alexandrian influenced texts. The first one says, the modern eclectic praxis operates on a variant unit basis without any apparent consideration of consequences. The resultant situation is simple. The best modern eclectic texts simply have no proven existence within transmissional history. Basically what he's trying to say is that he's arguing that the eclectic texts lack any historical continuity, and meaning that they don't reflect any transmission line from the early church. There's no line of transmission that shows these texts.
When did they start discovering? I think you mentioned it earlier on, the Alexandrian texts.
Yes, in the 19th century. Mid 19th, so 1844 was the.
Somebody dug something up.
Yeah. That's what it sounds like. And then they found some papyri. It's all in the same area, in Egyptian area, different cities and things like that. But obviously Alexandria.
But how did they survive the Muslim conquest? They would have been around everywhere.
Yeah, I don't know if they were like buried somewhere or left somewhere. I'm not. Yeah, and even that monastery, like I don't know how old that one was, but yeah. But to like in my sense, if they're chucking this out and they're gonna burn it, if that's the official story, doesn't that tell you something? Like, because these are priests, like.
Yeah, but the monastery in Sinai is more likely to be some form of Coptic monastery.
Yeah. So again, it would have been really Byzantine. So the early King James movement. They're getting rid of the But anyway, so that's one quote, and then we have another one. For the past century, eclecticism has functioned without an integrated history of textual transmission. That is, its resultant text that has no root in any single group of documents, or any text type is an unfortunate byproduct of its self-imposed methodology. So basically, highlights that the modern eclecticism operates without any historical basis, and so. So Yeah, because they found these texts, and then which is only a few texts, and then they consider them to be earlier, and so therefore must be more accurate, but they have significant variance within each other, and they can't find any other historical line where it supports this. So that's obviously an issue. And the last one is by a man named Peter Gurry, which I think he's actually a textual critic guy. He says there is a methodological gap between the start of the textual tradition, as we have it, and the text of the autograph itself, the originals. Any developments between the 2 points are outside the remit of textual criticism proper. So, points out that there is a gap between the earliest manuscripts and the original. So there's you can't find any, because it's 4th century, these texts. So there's obviously already a couple hundred years in between the original and these manuscripts. So you can't say that there is a link between them. Yeah.
But the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're only confirming what we call the Old Testament.
Yes.
They're not confirming anything.
No, they don't have anything to do.
Confirming the Jewish scriptures.
That's right. Yeah.
Is it called the Torah?
The Torah is the first 5 books.
First 5 books.
Yeah, of the Old Testament.
Right.
Yeah, first 5 books. The books of Moses. Yeah. Yeah, you have then the Old Testament is basically split into 3 categories. You've got the Torah, the Nevi'im, which is the prophets, and then the Ketuvim, which is the writings. So that's the law, the prophets, and the writings. Jesus refers to these categories. Yeah.
Law, prophets, and minor prophets, and
Yeah. The prophets would include the minor. Yeah. In the Jewish mind. Yeah. Yes. Okay. So that's it. So, any questions?